Welcome to the Faith and Feelings podcast. My name is Taylor Joy, and I'm passionate about helping you untangle and honor your emotions, authentically practice your faith, and integrate both into your everyday life so that you can experience the goodness and delight that comes from living in relationship with yourself, God, and others. Thank you for joining me. Let's get started. Over the last few months, we've been in a series on the podcast called Why on Earth Did I Do or Say That? This series has been all about emotional dysregulation, and this has probably been my favorite series yet. In the first few episodes, we talked about what emotional dysregulation is and what it feels like in our bodies. What is emotional dysregulation? Well, regulation is about being in balance. When we are regulated, or operating inside of our window of tolerance, we feel calm, steady, safe, and present. We feel like we can cope with whatever is happening in our lives. When we get dysregulated, something stressful is happening inside or outside of us that takes us out of balance. Our bodies can react to the stressor with strong feelings of anxiety or anger, or with this sense of numbness, as if your body wants to shut down. This isn't something you choose. These reactions just take over. Over the last few weeks, we've heard from 5 guests as they've shared recent stories of dysregulation. These stories have been so powerful in demonstrating how experiences of dysregulation are connected to our stories and what it looks like to process these experiences in real time. So this week and next week, I'm going to talk about the why we experience dysregulation, and next week, how this impacts our relationships with God. These 2 episodes have been slowly forming in my head over the last few weeks, and the idea first came during my conversation with licensed therapist David Flogi at the beginning of this series. This episode is one of the most popular episodes in the series. It's so good. If you haven't already, I really want to encourage you to go back and listen. I've linked the episode in the show notes. But towards the beginning of our conversation, I asked David why we experience dysregulation. His answer has stayed with me. He shared an example of when he was 4 or 5 years old. This was the first time he remembers feeling any kind of dysregulation. His mom was at the hospital having a baby, and when he asked his dad how long she would be gone, his dad responded with 2 or 3 days. But due to some complications, she was gone for much longer than that. Reflecting back, David remembers feeling some dysregulation. Why? He told me this, because I didn't have my capital R regulator, or in other words, my mom was not with me. And then he said this, and this is what I keep thinking about. A lot of dysregulation for children begins with experiences of trauma and or not having their regulator, their mother or father around. That's the root of it. In other words, and this is reflected in so much neuroscience literature right now, that your relationship with your parents growing up had a huge role in shaping your brain's capacity to regulate emotions. If you get easily dysregulated today or struggle to get back to a regulated state, there's a reason for that. In this episode, I'm going to show you how your present experiences of dysregulation are connected to your relationship with your primary caregivers when you were growing up. You're going to see how the emotional environment that you were raised in and the ways that your parents interacted and responded to you as a child shaped the way your brain learned to regulate. A lot of what I'm going to say here is taken from neuroscientists Bruce Perry and Alan Shore, psychiatrists Dan Siegel and Bessel van der Kolk, as well as therapist Adam Young. While this is certainly not comprehensive, my goal is to highlight some key points and major themes from their work that will hopefully be helpful in understanding what's beneath our experiences of dysregulation. So let's jump in. To set some of the groundwork for understanding these connections, it's really important to understand two key things about how the brain develops. First, if I were to ask you what you think influences the shaping of our brains more than anything else, what would you say? Maybe the first thought that comes to mind is nutrition or healthy movement, maybe medication or sleep, but this is actually not the case. The number one thing that influenced the development of your brain was relationships. Think about this for a minute. God designed relationships to play an essential role in how the structure and function of your brain developed. Second, your earliest experiences are disproportionately powerful in shaping your brain, much more than your later experiences in life. So when putting these two concepts together, what do they imply? Your earliest relationships with your primary caregivers shaped your brain more than anything else. When talking about this, I love how therapist Adam Young invites us to consider the language used in Genesis for describing the unique way that we were made in the image of God. In Genesis 1:26, God says, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness." Not let me make mankind in my image, but let us make mankind in our image. We were made in the image of a triune God. Or in other words, we were made in the image of relationship. God designed our bodies and brains for a deep connection with others. This is hardwired into who we are as a reflection of His image. And this leads us to the important topic of attachment. The term attachment and attachment styles have become buzzwords today. So maybe you've heard of some different attachment styles like anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, or secure attachment, which is considered the healthiest form of attachment. But what actually is attachment? Attachment is the emotional bond that you develop with people close to you. And secure attachment is built through something called attunement. To say this another way, attachment is built through one person's ability to be aware of and responsive to another person. I love how Dan Siegel describes attunement. This is what he says. When we attune with others, we allow our own internal state to shift, to come to resonate with the inner world of another. This resonance is at the heart of the important sense of feeling felt that emerges in close relationships. Children need attunement to feel secure and to develop well. And throughout our lives, we need attunement to feel close and connected. Secure attachment is so important. We'll talk more about this in a moment, but being securely attached is how we learn to self-regulate and how we learn to ask for help when we are experiencing some dysregulation. Secure attachment is the core foundation from which we learn to express emotions and relationships, feel comfortable with closeness, and to not be fearful within a relationship. I heard it said recently that being securely attached allows for a sense of freedom within relationships. We feel as though we have the capacity and agency to act in a way that is neither desperate nor detached from people. So as we think about this concept of attachment, how do we know if we have a secure attachment bond? There's so much research on this, and I'm going to be sharing a lot more in this week's Substack. Every week, I gather and create resources, YouTube videos, helpful links, favorite songs, processing guides, to help you go deeper into the topic of that week's episode. I send all of these resources to you via email every Wednesday. You can learn more and subscribe through the link in the show notes. But for right now, I want to hone in on 3 words that are deeply connected to the development of a secure attachment bond: engagement, responsiveness, and delight. Engagement, responsiveness, and delight. As we consider these words together, I'd love to invite you to reflect on 3 questions as you think about your earliest relationship with your primary caregivers. These questions often indicate secure attachment. But first, quick side note. I'm not a parent, but if you're a parent listening right now, I can imagine something happening as you hear these questions. I can imagine how easy it would be to begin analyzing your own parenting and, as our brains tend to do, gravitate towards all the things you wish you would have done differently. But if or when this happens, I want to invite you to shift back into considering your own childhood and how you were parented. Because as I've already briefly mentioned, our attachment with our primary caregivers is directly linked to our brain's capacity, our very ability to offer secure attachment to others. So the first question is this. Using Dan Siegel's words, as a child, did you feel felt by your parents? Were your parents attuned and engaged to what was happening inside of you? Were they aware of what you were feeling? When you came home from a hard day at school, did your parents see your distress or tears and move towards you with curiosity and empathy? Did they offer a listening ear in their presence in a way that communicated their desire to be with you in whatever emotional state you were in? To say this another way, did they invite your big emotions, especially difficult emotions like anger, sadness, and fear? Question number 2, did your parents notice and respond to your needs? While this certainly includes basic physical needs, this is much more than just food on the table and a roof over your head. This is about intuitively noticing and responding to your core emotional needs, as well as your need for loving physical touch. Keywords, when you needed it. In other words, were you held when you wanted to be held? Were you hugged when you wanted to be hugged? As a baby, were you put down when you wanted to be put down? Were you fed when you wanted to be fed? Or were your parents too overwhelmed, exhausted, or distressed by their own emotional states to notice and respond to your needs? Question number 3, did you feel delighted in by your parents? From birth, every child wonders the following questions. Do you see me? Do you hear me? Children know from birth whether or not their caregiver's eyes light up when they enter the room. We come into the world looking for smiling faces. So as a child, did you feel a sense of being liked when you were with your parents? When you were with your mom or dad, did you experience them as someone who was glad to be with you? Through their loving embraces, playful smiles, eye contact, and warm tone of voice, did they invite connection? I think it's important to note here that delight is different than praise. Though both, of course, are valuable, praise is generally about something that a child has done, where delight stems from enjoying the child exactly as they are. One of my favorite verses is Zephaniah 3:17, and it beautifully depicts this component of secure attachment offered from God. It says, "The Lord your God is with you, the mighty warrior who saves. He will take great delight in you. In his love, he will no longer rebuke you, but will rejoice over you with singing." As a child, did you feel the delight that your parents felt towards you, the real you? Now, before we move on, I just want to offer some space and ask, what was it like to hear those questions? What are some emotions that are coming up for you right now? Is there a certain question that you felt the strongest reaction towards? To wrap up this episode, I'm going to show you how our attachment with our primary caregivers is directly linked to our capacity to regulate our emotions today. At the beginning of this episode, I mentioned how your experiences in the first years of life is disproportionately powerful in shaping your brain. Research shows that the first year of your life is the most crucial in brain development. Why is this? Because as a child, you had a very limited ability to self-regulate. And as an infant, you had zero ability to self-regulate. No one comes out of the womb with this ability. Rather, you were completely dependent on the people around you. For example, earlier this morning, I woke up, and when I got hungry, I made myself breakfast. I self-regulated. However, infants rely completely on adults to provide external regulation. They rely on another person to regulate their emotions. When babies are hungry or thirsty or tired, they don't have the ability to feed themselves or put themselves down, or in other words, to self-regulate. They're out of balance, so they cry as a way to get back into balance. If you grew up in a nurturing, supportive, and caring environment, when you cried, someone responded to your needs and helped you regulate. Over time, your responsive parents helped your brain begin to develop self-regulating capabilities. As you grew up with this loving attention, the networks in your brain began to develop in a way that allowed you to regulate yourself and to connect with other people in healthy relationships. Your brain began associating people with words like safe, supportive, and caring. Over 1,000 small moments across your childhood, your brain developed as it gradually learned. The humans coming to regulate me are not bad. When I need something, it will work out. No one experiences perfect attunement from their parents as a child, but the key isn't perfection. It's consistency. As we repeatedly experience our parents' responsiveness to our needs, we build a secure attachment bond, and we learn to predict that help is available to us when we need it. We have embodied experiences of people coming for us when we are in distress, and these experiences literally shape the structure and function of our brains. As David Flogi said, our brains are literally formed on the neurological level by the presence or absence of regulators in our lives. So as we end this episode, what's the main point? What's the key takeaway? Here it is. If you have trouble regulating your emotions, and all insecurely attached adults have trouble regulating their emotions, this isn't random. If you tend to shut down emotionally or react strongly and then wonder why, if you tend to feel wound up or anxious or often feel like you're jumping out of your skin, there's a reason for that. And it goes back to how your brain developed as a child. During this series, I've heard from listeners who have reached out to me about feeling like they live in a state of dysregulation. This is incredibly common for people who have histories of trauma and or are insecurely attached. Why is this? Because your brain developed differently than someone who was securely attached. Not lacking, but differently on the neurological level. In fact, if you were to look at your brain scan and then a brain scan of someone who is securely attached, they would look different. We are going to talk a lot more about this next week, but it is possible to develop earned secure attachment and regulation skills in adulthood. Our brains have an amazing capacity to heal and change relationship patterns across our lifespan. But for right now, I want to end with this. If you often think, why on earth did I just do or say that? There's a reason for that. And that reason makes sense. Thank you for joining me for today's episode. I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on Instagram at TaylorJoy. If this conversation was helpful and you'd like more information about my other offerings to engage your story more deeply, check out my website, taylorjoymurray.co.